I've been diving for 2 decades. Storm wrecks, war graves, cargo ships torn in half. I've seen them all. But last winter, 180 miles off the coast, we found a vessel that shouldn't have been there. No rust, no barnacles, no record in any maritime log. At first, it was just strange. The way the hull seemed to pulse when the current hit it. The faint hum we heard through the water, like a heartbeat. Then we went inside. The client told us exactly where to go, exactly what to take. Said the ship wasn't built in the way we think. By the time I realized what that meant, it was too late. If you're watching this, tell me. Would you have kept diving or left it to the deep? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. They sent the paperwork over in an unmarked envelope. No return address, no company letterhead. Just a thick stack of clauses printed on thin, almost waxy paper, smelling faintly of salt. I'd been in this business long enough to know that high pay usually meant low ethics. Still, the numbers made me read every line twice. The upfront advance alone was more than most salvage jobs paid in a year. The completion bonus could set me up for a decade. Buried halfway down the contract were the rules. No photography, no recording, no radio contact outside the immediate crew. All recovered materials are property of the client, without exception. The strangest clause, all recovered items must remain sealed until transfer of custody. I'd seen salvage work for insurance companies, museums, even private collectors. All of them wanted documentation. This question mark. This smelled like the kind of job where you never ask what you're really looking for. The coordinates they provided were nowhere near any charted wreck. A stretch of open ocean 300 miles off the shipping lanes, too deep for casual diving, but shallow enough for a dedicated salvage vessel. On satellite images, it was just a patch of slate blue water, empty and unremarkable. That's the thing about the ocean. Most of it looks harmless from above. The client's representative called herself Elena, but her voice was the kind you remember. Controlled, clipped, every sentence precise. She refused to meet in person. We spoke once on a secure line before departure. "You will have 3 days on site," she said. "Do not exceed that window." "What happens if weather delays?" "There will be no delays," she interrupted. "You will recover the designated object and return without incident. If you encounter structural instability, withdraw immediately. The vessel has properties that make prolonged exposure unwise." She didn't elaborate. I didn't press. The deposit had already cleared. We sailed out on the Marlin, a converted research trawler with reinforced cranes and a decompression chamber bolted to the deck. My crew was 5 strong, all veterans of the trade. Reyes, my second, a quiet man with a knack for reading sonar like it was a language. Matthews, ex-Navy, our deep diver and muscle. Klein, an engineer who could keep a compressor running with duct tape and bad language. Tanaka, the medic, who'd stitched me up more than once. No one asked too many questions. The pay was enough to keep curiosity in check. The weather held for 2 days straight. Calm seas, low winds, pale sunlight broken by thin clouds. Unnatural for this part of the Pacific in late spring. On the morning of the 3rd day, we reached the coordinates. Reyes was the first to notice the anomaly. The sonar screen showed an object about 200 feet down, resting on a shelf of seabed. The outline was irregular, not like a cargo ship or tanker. The dimensions didn't match any wreck in maritime records. "Could be a natural formation," Reyes said, though he didn't sound convinced. Then the ping came, a faint, irregular echo. Thump, 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 threading through the sonar returns. I thought it was interference. Klein ran a diagnostics check. Nothing wrong with the equipment. The frequency was too low for machinery, too steady for random noise. Matthews leaned over the rail, peering down into the water as if he might see the sound itself rising. "Feels like a heartbeat," he muttered. We all laughed it off, but no one argued when I told them to suit up. Descending is always the same. The weight of the gear pressing down on your shoulders, the hiss of your regulator, the cold seeping in no matter how good the wetsuit. The world narrows to the circle of your mask, everything beyond a greenish blur. We dropped in pairs. I went with Matthews. The water was clearer than I expected at this depth, but there was a haze to it, like heat shimmer under the surface. At 80 feet, my ears popped hard. Matthews signaled the all clear. At 150, the shape began to take form. It wasn't a natural formation. It wasn't any ship I'd ever seen. The hull was smooth, unbroken by barnacles or coral. No rust, no corrosion. Just a dark, matte surface that seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. It rested at a slight angle, bow down, as if it had settled into the seabed. When I reached out and touched it, I felt the vibration through my glove. Not the steady hum of an engine, not the rattle of current against steel. A slow, deliberate thump, thump, thump. Matthews pulled his hand back like he'd touched something hot. His eyes behind the mask were wide. Through the comms, his voice came thin and uneven. "Tell me you feel that." I didn't answer, because in that moment, the heartbeat matched mine. The sea was flat, too flat. By the time the Marlin reached the coordinates, the water looked like poured glass, each swell rolling slow and even under a pale sky. The forecast had promised crosswinds and choppy swells by morning, but there was nothing, not even the low slap of current against the hull. Reyes stood by the sonar console, his brow drawn tight. "You're going to want to see this." The display pulsed in steady intervals, a faint green echo blooming at 200 feet. It wasn't large enough to be a freighter, too smooth in outline for a natural rock. Every few seconds, the signal deepened into a darker hue before returning to its baseline shape. "Could be a thermal layer messing with the read," Klein offered from behind him. Reyes shook his head. "Thermals don't pulse." We adjusted course, running a slow circle to bracket the target. The anomaly stayed locked in the center, as if it were anchored. Then the sound came. A low, muffled thump that rolled through the deck plates, more felt than heard. Even in the open air, it had weight to it. A measured beat, too slow for machinery, too steady for chance. Matthews stepped away from the rail. "Anyone else just feel that in their chest?" We ran a diagnostic sweep on the sonar array. All clear. No interference, no malfunction. Tanaka suggested maybe it was a whale, but the rhythm was wrong. Too clean. A whale's call wavered, echoed. This was exact, deliberate. The crew drifted into silence, eyes flicking between the flat water and the pulsing green mark on the screen. By mid-morning, the sky should have been closing in. The storm front visible on radar 2 days ago had simply dissolved. No wind, no swell, not even the sound of gulls overhead. The Marlin idled over the coordinates while we prepped gear. Full dive rigs, redundant air, underwater lights checked twice. If we were going down, it would be with everything in working order. As I suited up, I glanced toward the water. The surface shimmered faintly, as if a thin sheet of heat distorted the horizon. When I leaned over the rail, the shimmer vanished, replaced by a dark column rising from the depths, the shadow of whatever lay beneath us. Reyes called from the console. "It's still there, still pulsing." We dropped a weighted camera rig first, letting it descend until the line stopped. Static filled the feed for the first 100 feet, the image wavering in a haze of suspended silt. Then the shadow resolved, a smooth curve of dark material, no corrosion, no debris clinging to it. "That's no rock," Klein muttered. The camera's built-in hydrophone crackled once, then caught it. The same thump, 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 clearer now, resonating through the water like the inside of a drum. Reyes looked at me. "You want to call it?" "No," I said. We suit up. Matthews gave a sharp nod, already tightening his harness straps. Tanaka handed out dive slates, the laminated plastic boards where we'd jot notes underwater. No one spoke much. The crane swung the dive cage out over the side, cables groaning. The smell of salt and metal hung thick in the air. As I stepped inside, the deck beneath me seemed to pulse once, not with the vibration of the ship, but in time with the sound below, for a moment, I could swear it came up through the soles of my boots. Reyes's voice came over the radio. "Cage secure, lowering now." The winch engaged, and the surface began to recede. Light fractured into shifting blue as we sank. The heartbeat, if that's what it was, grew fainter, swallowed by the hiss of my regulator and the creak of the cage frame. At 60 feet, the water temperature dropped sharply. My mask fogged at the edges, cleared with a slow exhale. Shadows pooled beneath us, too solid to be current, too still to be schools of fish. At 150 feet, the first curve of the hull slid into view. The water around it shimmered faintly, like the heat mirage I'd seen above. The thump returned, closer now, threading through my breathing, steady as a clock. When the cage touched bottom, the silt barely stirred. No current, no sound, but the pulse. Matthews turned to me through his mask, raised his hand, and pointed toward the wreck. The gesture was sharp, urgent. The hull seemed to flex, just a fraction, as if something beneath the surface had drawn breath. The water was colder than it should have been for this depth. My regulator hissed with each draw, bubbles rolling past my ears and vanishing into the blue above. Matthews descended to my right, Klein just behind. Our dive lights cut narrow cones through the gloom, but the beams didn't travel far. A haze hung in the water, not silt, not plankton, more like a suspended shimmer, distorting edges as if we were looking through warped glass. The cage was behind us now, its steel frame a fading silhouette. I checked my depth gauge, 174 feet. The light dimmed another shade, shifting from deep blue toward green-black. I felt the pressure in my chest before I noticed it in my ears. Clean signaled fine. Matthews raised a hand and pointed ahead. The haze thinned, and the hull began to appear. It didn't rise like a normal wreck. No jagged lines, no collapsed masts or protruding steel. Just a single, unbroken curve of dark material sweeping out of the seabed at an angle. I swept my light across it. Nothing. The beam seemed to die on contact, swallowed instead of reflected. There were no barnacles, no streaks of rust, no sign that water had touched it in decades. I reached out, the fingertips of my glove brushing its surface. A vibration ran up my arm, subtle at first, like the hum of machinery through a bulkhead, then steadier, more deliberate. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't the sound of metal shifting under current. It was heavier, measured. Matthews turned his head toward me, regulator bubbles clouding his mask. He pressed his own palm against the hull, then snatched it back. We moved along the curve, following where it disappeared into the seabed. My dive light caught faint lines in the surface, not scratches, not weld seams. They branched irregularly, almost organic, like veins beneath skin. Klein tapped his wrist. Slate. Temperature plus 2 degrees Fahrenheit here. I checked mine. Same reading. The water shouldn't warm this suddenly, not down here. We stopped at a recessed section. An opening, maybe. The edges weren't jagged or fractured. They were smooth, as if molded that way. My light couldn't penetrate far inside, the beam scattering into darkness. Matthews moved closer, peering in. His light caught something just beyond reach, a faint ripple across the wall of the interior. It was moving. Through the comms, Klein's voice was muffled but tight. "You seeing that?" "Yeah," Matthews said, breathing. I didn't correct him. I wasn't sure it wasn't. I ran a hand along the inside edge of the opening. The surface was warmer than the surrounding water. Soft, almost imperceptibly, like there was give under the glove. For a moment, I thought it flexed toward my touch. My gauge flickered, needle twitching before steadying again. Klein's light dimmed, then flared. Static popped in my comms, sharp enough to make me wince. "Pull back," I said. "Regroup at the cage." We turned, and that's when I noticed it. The silt along the seabed had shifted, not stirred by us, but drawn in thin, spiraling trails toward the hull. The thump was louder now, though I couldn't tell if it was in my ears or inside my chest. We didn't speak the rest of the way up, only the hiss of breath and the muted clank of gear carrying us back through the haze. As the cage came into view, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The opening we'd left gaped wider than before. The opening was wider than before. Where we'd first seen only a narrow recess, there was now room for 2 divers to pass shoulder to shoulder. The edges looked the same, smooth, uniform. But as I approached, the shimmer in the water thickened, bending my dive light into a hazy cone. Matthews went in first. Klein followed, his tether lines scraping softly against the hull. I brought up the rear. The interior swallowed light. My beam cut no further than a few meters ahead, fading into a heavy darkness. Then, piece by piece, shapes began to take form. A table. Chairs bolted to the floor. a wall-mounted panel with controls and gauges frozen mid-readout. All of it intact, no rust, no algae, no sign water had ever touched it. I ran a hand across the panel face. It was dry beneath my glove, not just preserved, untouched. My knuckles scraped dust, not silt. "Pressure's holding," Klein's voice crackled through comms. "Feels like we're inside a sealed environment." Matthews swung his light toward the ceiling. Thin air bubbles clung to the upper surface, distorting in the light. Inside my mask, the water smelled faintly metallic, a dry tang layered over the stale taste of the regulator. We drifted further in, keeping the opening at our backs. The layout didn't match any ship schematic I'd seen. Narrow corridors branched away at odd angles, more like veins than passageways. Klein's light flickered twice, then steadied. "Anyone hear that?" Matthew's voice was low, but it carried the edge of something unspoken. I stopped moving, letting the regulator's hiss fade from my ears. A sound slid in beneath the silence. Slow, drawn out. Inhale, pause, exhale. It was faint, but the comms picked it up, each breath just low enough to make me doubt it was real. I signaled for us to hold position. The sound continued, steady and unhurried. It wasn't coming from behind us. Matthews tilted his head toward the passage on our right. I swept my light into the opening. The beam caught nothing, then vanished into black. Something in that darkness shifted. "Movement," I said into the comm, 1 meter inside the right corridor. Klein's gauge chirped, needle flicking before returning to normal. My depth readout did the same. The breathing stopped. We pressed on toward what looked like a central chamber. Furniture was still upright, straps dangling from chair arms, as if whatever had been seated there had simply unbuckled and walked away. Papers lay scattered on the table, dry, edges curling. The writing indecipherable, made of looping marks that weren't any language I knew. The air pockets above distorted again, shifting as though stirred by a breeze that didn't exist. Matthews moved closer to the far wall, running his hand over its surface. He turned back, voice tight in the comms. "It's warm." I crossed to him. The surface beneath my glove gave slightly under pressure, like thick leather. The warmth wasn't from any light or machinery. It felt like body heat. Klein backed toward the opening, his tether line going taut. "I don't like this. Feels like we're inside something that's not supposed to be open." I didn't argue. The breathing returned, louder this time, threading through the comms with enough depth to make the water around us seem to tremble. We started for the opening. My light swung back once toward the table. One of the straps was moving, slowly curling and uncurling in the still water. The needle on my depth gauge trembled, not a random twitch, a precise, rhythmic sway. Thump, needle forward, thump, needle back. I held it steady in my grip, but the movement stayed in perfect time with the sound reverberating through the hull. Matthews noticed it too. He raised his own gauge, watching the motion with narrowed eyes. "That's not current," he said over comms. Klein swiveled his light along the wall beside us. "Pressure fluctuations," he guessed, though his voice lacked conviction. "Could be thermal vents nearby." "Vents don't breathe," Matthews replied. We regrouped near the opening, tether lines brushing softly against the bulkhead. The warmth in the wall hadn't faded. If anything, it was stronger now, radiating faintly through our gloves. I checked the gauge again. The needle kept pace with the thump, unwavering, as if the entire environment around us was expanding and contracting in slow, measured beats. "Call it?" Klein asked. I hesitated. The rules in the contract echoed in the back of my mind. All recovered materials are property of the client, without exception. We hadn't recovered anything yet. Before I could answer, Elena's voice cut through the comm channel, clear despite the static. "Continue. You are to collect environmental samples and structural readings before extraction." Matthews's head snapped toward me. "She's patched into our comms?" "She's the client," I said. "Means she's probably been listening the whole time." No one liked that, but we didn't argue. We were being paid to follow instructions, and until the gear was back on deck, we were under her control. Klein unpacked the sample kit from his tether pouch. He scraped a section of wall, or whatever passed for a wall, into one of the sealed vials. The material bent slightly under the blade before parting, the texture somewhere between hardened resin and thick skin. The fragment inside the vial twitched once before settling. Matthews saw it too. That just moved. Klein didn't respond. He sealed the vial, clipped it to his harness, and gestured toward a corridor leading deeper inside. The thump grew louder in that direction, and with each beat, my chest felt faintly compressed, like diving deeper without adjusting buoyancy. We advanced slowly, dive lights probing each new section. The corridor walls bore the same branching lines we'd seen before, but here they pulsed faintly in time with the sound. Halfway down, my comms hissed, a quick burst of static, and a single word bled through. Closer. Repeat, I asked, but no one answered. Klein claimed he hadn't spoken, and Matthews swore the word hadn't come from him. We reached a larger chamber, roughly circular, with low fixtures set into the floor. They might have been storage containers once, but now each was fused to the surface, as though grown there. I swept my light across one. The surface rose and fell almost imperceptibly. Klein began logging readings. Matthews moved to the far side of the room, tracing the outline of what looked like another sealed hatch. The metal, if it was metal, was warmer than anything else we'd touched. "Feels like it's pulling heat in," he said. The thump came again, heavier this time, vibrating through the floor into my boots. Over comms, Elena's voice returned. "You're in proximity to the central mass. Do not attempt to breach it yet. Continue collecting until instructed otherwise." "Central mass?" Matthews asked, but she didn't reply. The gauges flickered again, all at once. For a few seconds, every depth reading dropped by 10 feet before correcting itself. The thump didn't stop. I signaled for us to head back toward the opening. The contract didn't mention what we were salvaging, only that it had to be recovered intact. But looking at the walls, feeling the pulse through my gloves, I knew the wreck wasn't just holding something. It was the something. As we retraced our path, the pulse accelerated slightly, almost in sync with our fin strokes. I kept my light on the opening ahead, but in my periphery, the walls seemed to ripple with each beat. When we emerged into the outer chamber, I glanced back one last time. A single bubble drifted up from the warm surface of the wall and burst into a faint wisp of steam. Klein's magnetometer started screaming halfway back to the cage. The needle shot hard to the right, then spun erratically, clattering against its stops. He slapped the casing, but it didn't settle. The display stayed redlined, even though there wasn't a single known metallic structure within arm's reach. "Interference?" I asked over communications. "Not like this," he replied. "It's pegged, but there's nothing to peg on." Matthews swung his light toward the bulkhead beside us. It was the same as the rest, smooth, dark, unbroken. But when I brought my own meter close, the signal spiked again, as if the wall itself was magnetic 1 second and inert the next. The water temperature shifted too. 1 step forward and it was bone cold against my cheeks. 1 step back and it felt almost tepid, the way shallows warm under a midday sun. It didn't follow depth or current. It followed location. We paused in front of a section where the surface rose in a faint ridge. I ran my light along it and saw the branching vein-like lines widen slightly with each thump. Klein gestured to the sample kit clipped to my harness. I unlatched it, took out the coring blade, and pressed the edge into the wall. It resisted at first, like pushing into dense rubber. Then it yielded with a slow, fibrous tear. When the sample came free, it curled slightly in the water. Not splintered, not chipped, and not wood. The cut surface glistened faintly, pale strands laced through darker material, like muscle shot through with sinew. Klein sealed it in a vial. The moment the lid twisted shut, the sample flexed once, a ripple running the length of it. "That's not possible," he said quietly. Matthews didn't respond. His light had caught something further down the corridor, a section of wall where the veins converged into a knot the size of a dinner plate. With each pulse, the knot swelled fractionally, then receded. We approached. The magnetometers went wild again, readings jumping in irregular bursts. The warmth radiating from the knot was enough to fog my mask slightly. I didn't touch it. Neither did Matthews. Through the comms, Elena's voice came again. "Log that position. Do not tamper. Continue mapping. We moved on, the corridor narrowing until only one diver could pass at a time. The temperature shifts grew sharper, sudden pockets of heat that lasted seconds before bleeding back to cold. Somewhere ahead, a new sound joined the heartbeat, a low, intermittent clicking, like the ticking of cooling metal. We reached another chamber. The floor here was uneven, a series of raised shapes that didn't look manufactured. I knelt beside one, ran my glove over its surface. The magnetometer spiked, then went dead. The raised shape gave under my weight. Klein turned sharply. We're standing on it. I didn't ask what he meant. The thump rolled through the chamber again, and the floor under my boots shifted, just enough to make me adjust my balance. We started for the exit, not speaking. As my light swept across the wall one last time, I saw the knot-like formation again, smaller here, but each one pulsing in perfect unison. As we neared the opening, the clicking stopped. In the sudden quiet, the next heartbeat felt louder than all the rest, and this time it came with a slow, deliberate creak, like something inside the hull was stretching awake. Matthews was behind me one moment, and gone the next. I didn't see him drift, didn't see a fin kick out of place. 1 second, his dive light was playing over the bulkhead to my left. The next, there was only darkness where he'd been. "Klein, visual?" I asked over communications. "Negative," he replied immediately. His light swept the corridor, cutting through haze and nothing else. No movement. I pivoted back toward where Matthews had been working. The section of wall he'd been examining was different now. It bulged slightly inward, a faint indentation where the surface should have been flush. I swam to it, ran my glove along the area. It felt softer than the rest of the hull, with a strange elasticity under pressure. The texture reminded me of pressing against a thick membrane stretched tight. The thump rolled through it, and under my hand, I felt the wall expand slightly, then retract. Then Matthews's voice cut through the comms, breathless and uneven. "I'm here. I'm..." Static chewed the rest of it. Klein's eyes behind his mask were wide. "Direction?" I checked my bearings. His signal was coming from the other side of the bulkhead. But according to the wreck's interior map, there was no other side. That section should have been solid. 90 seconds after disappearing, Matthews emerged from the far end of the corridor, light swinging wildly. He was breathing hard, bubbles streaming in ragged bursts. I caught his tether line and steadied him. "Where the hell did you go?" He didn't answer at first, just shook his head. His hands stayed close to his chest, fingers curled tightly around his dive slate. Finally, he keyed his comm. "I got pulled. Wall gave way." "Pulled by what?" Klein asked. "Not sure," Matthews said. "It was like the hull moved around me, squeezed. Next thing I knew, I was in a different corridor." We checked the slate. His notes were short. No lights, no sound. Walls moving. He refused to elaborate beyond that. When I told him we'd need to retrace his path, he cut me off immediately. "I'm not going back in there," he said flatly. We resumed toward the opening, Matthews keeping to the rear. I noticed his tether was shorter now, frayed near the clip. The end was slick, as if it had been drawn through something that left residue. The thump followed us, slower now, but heavier, each beat carrying a subtle shift in the surrounding water. As we cleared the last bend, my light caught movement along the corridor wall. The indentation where Matthews had vanished was gone. In its place, the surface was smooth, unbroken, as if it had never been there at all. The bulkhead in front of me moved, not a sway from current or the creak of settling metal. It shifted inward, slow and deliberate, like a lung pulling in air. The movement stopped as abruptly as it started, the surface returning to its original position without a sound. I signaled for Klein to hold position. He raised his light, beam sliding across the wall. The matte surface swallowed the brightness, leaving only the faint network of vein-like lines. With each thump, they seemed to throb, swelling and fading under the glow. Matthews stayed back, keeping his light low. The heartbeat was louder here, more defined. It pressed against my chest in faint pulses, almost matching my breathing, until I forced myself to slow it. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. Our dive lamps dimmed in unison, not a total blackout, but enough to push the room's edges into shadow. Through the gloom came a sound, low, resonant, and impossibly deep. It wasn't a metallic groan like a ship settling under pressure. It was organic, drawn out, with an undertone that reminded me of a whale call. The vibration carried through the walls and into the water, making my mask tremble against my face. Clean muttered something under his breath. I checked my gauges. The depth reading held steady, but the compass needle spun slowly, never finding north. The sound faded, replaced again by the thump, thump, thump. Matthews spoke over comms, his voice clipped. We should move, now. We pushed forward along the corridor, the passage narrowing until we had to go single file. Every few meters, the bulkheads curved inward in subtle waves, just enough to make me slow and adjust. I kept thinking of Matthew's description, the walls squeezing around him, and forced my mind back to the task. Halfway through, another shift. This time, I saw it clearly. The wall on my left contracted inward, brushing my shoulder as I passed. The sensation wasn't metal on gear. It was soft, yielding, warm. Confirmed movement, I said into the comms. No one answered. The silence made the heartbeat feel louder, faster. Ahead, the corridor opened into a small chamber. At its center was a column rising from floor to ceiling, covered in the same vein-like patterns. With each beat, they brightened faintly, like light passing through fluid. Clean moved closer to take readings. As soon as his hand hovered near the surface, the veins contracted inward, vanishing beneath the matte skin. The thump that followed was heavier than before, rattling the gear on my harness. We backed away toward the exit. The corridor behind us no longer looked the same. The angle had shifted, the curve of the walls more pronounced, as if the space was narrowing. I didn't look back again until we reached the opening. The bulkhead we had first seen breathing now swelled outward, slow and full, and released the air in a long, low groan. Elena's voice cut into our comms before we even cleared the chamber. You've located the core structure, she said. You're close. Proceed to the captain's quarters. Her tone was calm, but not neutral. There was a weight to it, a focus that made Klein glance at me through his mask. Captain's quarters? I said. This isn't laid out like any ship. It isn't a ship, she interrupted. At least, not in the human sense. The thump echoed through the bulkhead beside me, almost as if responding to her words. You want to explain that? I asked. There was a brief pause, then. We've been searching for this object for decades. It predates recorded history. The construction is biological, and it's incomplete. The static in her transmission pulsed in and out, syncing with the heartbeat. Biological, Matthews said, his voice sharp. You mean alive? Another pause. Pre-human, she corrected. Older than the oldest known maritime cultures. Its original function is unknown, but it is aware. Klein shifted uneasily. And you still want us inside it? You are to proceed to the captain's quarters, Elena said, her tone flattening. Retrieve a black container, cylindrical, sealed. Do not open it. Handle it as little as possible. It will be in the forward chamber, top deck level. You'll know it when you see it. What's in it? I asked. Her answer came without hesitation. Not your concern. The line went silent, except for the low crackle of water interference. The thump rolled through the corridor again, heavier than before. Matthews keyed his mic. We're just supposed to take her word and walk deeper into this thing, Klein muttered, not like we're walking. We adjusted our buoyancy and pushed forward. The route to the top deck wasn't marked. Elena had given no navigation details, so we moved by feel, following corridors that seemed to slope upward in wide, curling arcs. The walls narrowed at irregular intervals, forcing us to move single file. In those moments, the water felt thicker, as if it resisted our passing. Halfway up, my light caught something in a side alcove, a cluster of objects half embedded in the wall. They were uniform in shape, sealed inside a translucent sheath. Through the layer, I could make out familiar outlines: dive knives, flashlight, housings, a section of corroded chain. Some of the objects looked centuries old, others modern. Salvage gear, Klein said. From other teams? Looks like it, I answered. Matthews stayed silent, but I saw his grip tighten on his tether line. The corridor opened into a larger space. If Elena's terminology was to be believed, this was the top deck. It had the proportions of a ship's officer quarters, but the walls curved in ways no blueprint could account for. At the far end was a recessed arch. Beyond it, a chamber that felt different. The water inside shimmered faintly, distorting everything within like heat rising off asphalt. The heartbeat grew sharper here, each beat sending a faint tremor through my regulator mouthpiece. Inside the chamber was a single upright fixture waist-high, partially fused into the floor. Resting atop it was a cylinder, matte black, its surface smooth but faintly dimpled, like the skin of a fruit. No dust, no corrosion. "That's it," Klein said. "Get it in the containment case," I told him. He slid the case from his harness, opened it, and lifted the cylinder. For a fraction of a second, I thought I saw the surface flex under his gloves. As soon as the lid closed over it, the thump jumped in speed. Not wildly, just enough to make it feel more urgent. The walls around the chamber seemed to ripple outward, as if making room for us to leave. We turned toward the arch. That was when the corridor beyond it sealed shut. A single, seamless wall now filled the opening. No sign it had ever been open at all. The wall that had sealed the exit was smooth and seamless. Not a hatch, not a door, just an unbroken curve where open space had been seconds before. Matthews swore under his breath. Klein kept his light on the surface, moving it slowly as if some hidden seam might reveal itself. Nothing did. We turned back toward the chamber. The heartbeat was sharper now, each beat pushing faint tremors through my chest plate. The black cylinder sat on its pedestal in the center of the room, as if waiting. Klein stepped toward it. "If this is the captain's quarters," he said quietly, "that's the captain's log." The room was otherwise immaculate. Chairs bolted to the floor, a desk-like structure against the far wall. Papers, if they were papers, scattered in a deliberate way, edges curling but intact. They were covered in looping script I couldn't place, the characters more like coiled strands than written language. No dust, no moisture. I ran my glove over the desk surface. The material was warm, not wood, not metal. Under the heat, there was a subtle give, the same soft resistance we'd felt in other parts of the wreck. Klein crouched at the pedestal, running his hand around the base of the cylinder. His fingers pressed into the surrounding floor and left faint indentations that slowly smoothed over. "It's fused," he said, not sitting on it, in it. I joined. Him, feeling where the surface met the object. It was seamless. The material around it was pliable but strong, flexing slightly when I pushed, then closing back in. Matthews moved to the doorway and kept his light on the sealed wall. "We're not leaving without it, right?" Klein took out the flat-edge cutter from his harness. He slid the blade between the object and the floor. For a moment, it sank easily. Then resistance, like the material beneath, had tightened. The thump grew faster. Not frantic, but noticeably closer together. My gauge trembled with each one. As he worked, the air bubbles clinging to the ceiling above us shifted. They slid across the surface, merging into larger pockets, as if something inside the structure was exhaling against the chamber. Klein pried harder. The blade bent. The surface around the cylinder pulsed outward once, like a muscle pushing back. "Stop," I said. "It's reacting." He paused. The thump slowed slightly, but didn't return to its original pace. The floor under the pedestal felt warmer now, the heat faintly radiating into my gloves. Matthews spoke over comms. "Maybe it wants us to take it. Maybe that's why it's here." Elena's voice cut in, her tone clipped. "You will retrieve the container. No matter what happens, it must remain sealed. Do not hesitate." Klein looked at me. I nodded once. He slid the cutter in again, this time at an angle, working around the base. The material flexed reluctantly, releasing the object with a faint tearing sound. The moment it came free, the heartbeat spiked, each pulse accompanied by a low groan that vibrated through the chamber. The object was heavier than it looked. Klein set it directly into the containment case, the lid sealing with a soft hiss. The walls around us rippled outward, a slow, undulating motion that traveled across the surface like something massive, shifting just beneath. Matthews stepped back toward the sealed wall. The section shimmered faintly, and then, without sound, began to recede, revealing the corridor beyond. None of us moved right away. The corridor was unchanged, but the water felt different now, thicker, as though the space itself was heavier. As we left the chamber, I glanced back at the pedestal. The surface where the object had been was closing in on itself, the opening shrinking with each beat until it was smooth and unbroken once more. The last thing I saw before turning away was one of the papers on the desk. It curled upward at the edge, and for a second, I thought it twitched. The water was flat when we broke the surface, but the marlin was pitching hard, rocking in short, sharp bursts. Reyes was at the rail, waving us toward the lift. His face was pale, jaw tight. "Move! Cables are under strain." We hauled ourselves into the cage, the winch whining as it took our combined weight. Even through my hood, I could hear the cable groaning under tension. Once we were clear of the water, I saw the source. The main lift line didn't hang straight. It angled down and away from the hull, pulled by something deep beneath. The same was true for the equipment umbilicals. They bowed outward in slow arcs, as if being drawn toward a fixed point just off our starboard side. "Cut the lines!" Reyes shouted to Klein, but Klein's gear was still clipped in. The containment case with the black cylinder hung at his side, water still streaming from its seal. The deck shuddered, not from a wave, from something tugging below. The sound traveled up through the hull, a deep, dragging vibration. Matthews was the last out of the cage. His regulator was still in, eyes scanning the water below the rail. Then he froze. His light, still dangling from its tether, swung down into the sea. Through the beam, I caught a glimpse of movement just under the surface. Not a shape, not a shadow. More like the water itself, folding inward. Matthews tore the regulator from his mouth and screamed. It wasn't words, just raw sound, loud enough to cut over the winch motor. He stumbled back, pointing, breath coming in ragged pulls. "It's here. It's right here." Reyes and I looked over the side. Nothing. Just black water, calm except for the pull on the lines. The deck pitched again, harder this time. A wrench clattered across the boards, spinning before stopping at Klein's boots. "Line's about to go," Reyes said. "Cut it, or we lose the crane." Klein fumbled with the release. The umbilical snapped upward, spraying a fine mist as it recoiled. The tension on the lift line eased, but the vibration in the hull didn't stop. Matthews backed toward the wheelhouse, still pointing toward the water. His mask hung from one hand, the strap swinging against his wrist. He was pale under the salt. Reyes kept his eyes on the horizon. No swells, no wind. Whatever's moving us isn't surface. The thump reached us even here, faint but steady. I felt it through the soles of my boots before I heard it in my ears. Each beat was stronger than the last, and with every one, the lines along the starboard rail trembled like something was plucking them from below. Matthew's breathing went ragged again. "It's looking at us," he said. "I can feel it." He cut off suddenly, eyes going wide, his gaze locked on the water just off the bow. I followed it and saw a single bubble break the surface, large, slow, rising straight up from deep below. When it popped, a faint curl of steam drifted from the hole it left behind. The winch brake was locked, but the crane arm still shifted in slow, uneasy arcs. Whatever strain was coming up from below was traveling straight through the steel. Reyes met my eyes. "If we leave the rest of the gear, it'll tear the housing off." I was already pulling my mask back on. "Then I'll go get it." The water was colder this time. The surface light bled away fast, turning green, then black. My dive torch cut a narrow tunnel through the murk, and I kept my fins steady, following the faint glint of the dropped rigging down toward the wreck. The thump returned before I saw it, slower than before, but heavier. Each beat pushed faint ripples through the silt on the seabed. When the hull emerged from the dark, I stopped finning. It was moving, not drifting, shifting. The slope of the bow was different, the angle of its settling altered. It was pulling free of the seabed in tiny, deliberate motions, sending pale streams of disturbed sediment upward. The starboard side was opening. Sections of the hull flexed outward in slow arcs, like gills on some vast fish. The motion was soundless, but a warm current rolled out with each expansion, brushing past me with the faint scent of iron. Inside the openings, the darkness wasn't uniform, it flowed. I eased closer, using the crane line as a guide. The shadows within didn't respond to my light. They moved on their own, folding and unfurling against each other like currents beneath ice. Every so often, two shapes would merge, forming a single mass before slipping apart again. The gear crate lay half buried near the keel. I clipped a tether to it, signaling up to the deck crew. The line went taut, almost immediately. That's when the nearest gill began to close. The motion wasn't quick, but it was steady, the curved plates drawing together like eyelids. I backed away, kicking hard, but the warm current it expelled shifted, now flowing inward, as if pulling water toward it. My depth gauge jittered, then froze. In the periphery of my beam, one of the shadows slid forward, parting from the rest. It held shape, elongated, twisting, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something like a limb press against the inner surface before retreating. The heartbeat rose in tempo, each pulse deep enough to make my regulator rattle. I cleared the crate's position, letting the lift take it. The cable zipped upward, vibrating faintly. When I turned back to the wreck, the gills were closing in sequence, each sealing with a slow, smooth fit until the hull was whole again. Only the faint branching lines and the low tremor under my fins hinted at the movement I'd seen. As I began my ascent, I passed a long fracture in the hull, something I hadn't noticed before. Inside, the shadows were still moving. They didn't retreat this time. They pressed closer to the opening, as if following me up. The wreck was rising. It wasn't fast, but it was deliberate. A slow surge that lifted silt in broad clouds and sent the remaining cables on the Marlin bowing under the strain. My depth gauge climbed by the foot, even though I wasn't moving. Above, the winches groaned. Through my comms, Reyes barked at the deck crew to cut lines before they tore the arms off entirely. The water thickened as the wreck shifted. Not visually. My torch still cut the same narrow path, but in resistance. Every kick felt heavier, as though the water itself was pushing back. I grabbed the nearest guideline and started upward, the heartbeat thudding into my forearms through the rope. Each pulse felt stronger than the last. Klein was ahead of me, pulling hand over hand. The slack in his tether snapped taut and jerked him sideways, sending him hard into the hull. The contact wasn't metal on metal. I saw the surface give slightly under his weight before shoving him off like a slow recoil. "Cutting main," Reyes's voice came over the comms. The sudden release was immediate. The tension in the cables dropped, but the wreck didn't stop ascending. It kept its steady climb, pulling the surrounding water into a slow, spiraling current. That current found Matthews first. He'd been trailing us by several meters, working free of a snagged line when the flow caught him. 1 second, he was kicking against it. The next, his fins lifted, and he was sliding backward toward an open section of hull. I saw it flex before he reached it. The gill plates drew back in slow sequence, revealing the darkness within. Warmth spilled out, carrying that same faint scent of iron. "Matthews, break right," I shouted, but the current pushed harder, angling him directly into the opening. Klein lunged, caught his tether, and braced against the crane line. The pull stretched the cord between them into a tight arc. My own gear vibrated with the strain. Matthews kicked free of the current's grip with a final desperate push, clearing the opening by barely a meter. The plates began to close immediately, sealing without a sound. We regrouped at 20 feet. The wreck hung below us, no longer fully on the seabed. Its shadow seemed darker than the surrounding water, a mass pulling the light out of everything around it. It didn't follow, but it didn't sink back either. It just hovered, suspended in its slow heartbeat. When I broke the surface, Reyes was already at the rail, cutting the last of the auxiliary lines with a torch. The Marlin rocked in place, though the sea around us was calm. Beneath the hull, the water shifted in broad, circular motions, as if the wreck was deciding whether to come closer. The last thing I saw before climbing aboard was one of the gill plates opening again in the dark, a narrow, vertical slit aimed upward. It didn't move toward us. It just stayed open, like an unblinking eye. The containment case was empty. I'd opened it on deck to secure the cylinder for transport, and all that stared back was a shallow indentation where it had rested. The seal wasn't broken. The latches were still locked. but whatever had been inside was gone. Reyes didn't speak. He just looked at me and then at the water. The decision didn't need words. I was going back down. The air was colder now, the kind of chill that cut straight through neoprene. My regulator hissed in quick, shallow bursts as I slipped beneath the surface. The light faded faster than before, as if the wreck itself was dimming the water around it. The heartbeat was already there, pulsing through the current, low and heavy. With each beat, the water seemed to thicken, resisting every kick. I descended along the crane line until the hull came into view. It wasn't still anymore. The surface flexed in slow, rolling contractions, the vein-like patterns along its length swelling and receding like blood moving under skin. Sections of the hull pulsed outward, then drew tight, as though the entire structure was breathing faster. The entry we'd used earlier was already open, the gill plates drawn back in smooth arcs. Warm current poured out, carrying that same metallic tang. I drifted inside, keeping one hand on the wall. It felt alive. The texture shifted under my glove in subtle ripples, following the movement of my hand as though it was aware of me. Inside, the light from my torch wavered, not from the beam itself, but from the walls. They expanded and contracted in slow rhythm, narrowing the passage ahead before widening again. The thump was deafening now. My regulator rattled against my teeth. I reached the chamber where we'd found the cylinder. The pedestal was gone, not removed, absorbed. The floor was smooth and unbroken, as if it had never been there at all. Above me, the ceiling shifted. Air pockets slid across its surface, merging into a single large bubble that drifted directly overhead. Something moved in the corridor behind me. Not the slow shadows I'd seen before. This was faster, sliding along the walls, its outline deforming and reforming in fluid shapes. The heartbeat accelerated. The walls drew closer, not crushing, but closing in enough that I could feel the pressure change in my ears. I checked my gauge. Depth reading, blank. Compass, spinning. Timer, reset to 0. When I looked back toward the entrance, it was gone. The corridor had folded in on itself, replacing open space with smooth, seamless wall. The warm current shifted direction, now drawing inward toward the center of the wreck. I felt it tug at my fins, pulling me deeper into the narrowing passage. Somewhere ahead, in the muffled roar of my own breathing, I thought I heard something else. Not the heartbeat, not the groan of the hull. A slow, deliberate inhale. The wreck let go of us. It didn't happen gradually. One moment, the current was dragging us inward. The next, it reversed, shoving me back through a seam in the hull that hadn't been opened seconds earlier. My mask filled with silt as I tumbled out into open water, regulator clattering against my teeth. Behind me, the structure shuddered, not from impact or collapse, but as if something inside had exhaled. I kicked upward, following the faint silhouette of the crane line. My depth gauge came back online at 60 meters. The heartbeat faded with every meter I climbed, but not enough to vanish completely. It stayed there, like a pressure in the jawbone, a low thump carried through the water. When I broke the surface, Reyes was already pulling me in. His gloves caught my shoulder straps, yanking me onto the ladder. "Where's the container?" he asked. I shook my head. The deck was chaos. One winch cable had been snapped clean in two. Another was tangled in coils that looked like they'd been braided by hand. No one spoke about Matthews. His tank was still strapped to the railing, his mask sitting on the deck. The client stood at the stern, staring at the water. He didn't ask about casualties, didn't ask about damage, only turned to the captain and said, "We're done here." We started pulling anchor before I'd even stripped out of my gear. The swells were picking up, though the skies were clear. Every few seconds, the hull of our own vessel would groan in a way that made us glance toward the horizon. By the time we cleared the site, the wreck had already slipped below sonar range. No trace on depth sounder, no reflection on GPS, just empty coordinates. That night, we tried reviewing the dive logs. Every file was gone, not deleted, overwritten. The timestamps were still there, but each file contained nothing but static hiss and a flat line of sensor data. The captain cursed, blaming corrupted storage. But Reyes checked the backups. They were blank too. At dawn, the client was gone. His cabin empty, berth unslept in. No tender missing from the racks. No splash heard in the night. In the logbook, his name had been crossed out with a single line. By the time we made port, the crew had stopped speaking about it. Gear was cleaned, accounts settled, no mention of the expedition beyond the usual rough weather, bad luck. But I kept one note. Not on the manifest, not in the logs. Just a single line in my own handwriting, folded into the back of my kit bag. If you find a wreck with no rust and a pulse, leave it to the deep.